Welcome to this special program. Today we are joined by Guyana's permanent representative to the United Nations, Ambassador Michael Tenpo. Ambassador, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Tiffany.
Ambassador, let's start out first by defining what it is the permanent representative to the United Nations does, or what that position entails.
The question is what the position of permanent representative entails. I have to tell you that the title is much longer than that. It's actually Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of Guyana to the United Nations. I'm often embarrassed by that title. But in fact, it points to a difference between the United Nations and, let's say, our embassy in China. So we have a number of embassies and high commissions in the case of members of the Commonwealth, where it's essentially a bilateral post where a Guyanese diplomat and ambassador is accredited to a country or a group of countries. That is essentially bilateral. This is a multilateral post because the ambassador of Guyana is accredited here to the entire United Nations system. And so the embassy is not referred to as an embassy. It's a mission, the permanent mission of Guyana to the United Nations, and the ambassador is referred to as the permanent representative.
Okay, so you're posted to the entire UN. That is a very big organization that is working in several sectors
Yes.
across the globe. It has 193 members, of which Guyana is one. Can you tell us some of the areas that you're representing Guyana at the UN, at the UN?
Well, this happens to be the headquarters of this sprawling organization. As you say, the UN is located over many continents and different locations. There are areas of specialization. By far, most of the work of the UN is done here. But you also have another regional office in Geneva. That's also an important United Nations center. And as you would be aware, we recently accredited an ambassador, Ambassador Deep Ford, to Geneva, the UN in Geneva, but also to Switzerland. And Geneva deals with essentially human rights issues. There is a center in The Hague, in the Netherlands, dealing with questions of justice. The International Court of Justice is located there. Many other bodies that have to do with justice are located there. International Criminal Court, for example. You have a center in Vienna, which houses the International Atomic Agency, IAEA, and I think UNIDO, which is the Industrial Development Organization. So each headquarters is specialized in some area. There's also in Africa, by the way, in Nairobi, the United Nations Environment Program, which is located there. But here you've got a range, and we'll have the opportunity to talk about some of the specific areas that headquarters deals with.
Let's talk about what the mission here in New York deals with and that you are heading.
Well, look, when I was appointed last year, I was given a mandate. The priorities of the mission were defined. And our first priority is to preserve the territorial integrity of Guyana. So that's my and the mission's top priority. As you know, right now, that issue is in the hands of the United Nations, of the Secretary General, and he has a personal representative. So the mission is the go-between, the intermediary between the United Nations and the government of Guyana, and I serve as that intermediary. So that's the first and most important mandate. Without a country, all the other issues we deal with, sustainable development goals, development and so on, would not be possible. The second important area of responsibility is to engage with the huge range of organizations that make up this United Nations system. As you know, the United Nations, its work is divided into three main areas. by no means neat pigeonholes, but by and large, there's the question of peace and security, which is the principal organ with responsibility for that area is the Security Council. And I like to lump justice under that broad rubric. And so we bring in the International Court of Justice. And it so happens that Guyana has an interest in both of those organs, the Security Council and, of course, for reasons which you know, the ICJ. So that's the first pillar. The second pillar is development. The United Nations plays an important role in helping developing countries achieve development, and right now it has a framework for doing so, which are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that came after the expiration of the Millennium Development Goals, which were achieved, or in some cases not fully achieved, in 2015. So now we have these Sustainable Development Goals that basically encapsulate the targets and the objectives for development of the developing world by a date certain, which is 2030. And the third aspect is human rights, dealt with in Geneva, but that is the third pillar of the United Nations work. The United Nations set standards how we should treat each other as human beings, respect the essential dignity of human beings in many different ways, and it sets norms and standards which countries, not all at the same time, but over time, they come to be accepted as the standards that should govern interactions between people and between governments and people.
Ambassador, the President's address to the UN yesterday focused on people and
Yes.
the achievement or achieving these SDGs set out by the United Nations. How is the mission helping the country towards achieving those 17 SDGs?
Right. Well, the responsibility for achieving the SDGs, as you know, lies with individual countries. We're supposed to embrace them as goals. The UN is not engaged in providing all of the resources. It helps, of course, but we are required to change our laws, for example, in some cases, to adopt legislation, to adapt our policies and approaches to these goals and to prioritize them. And the goals, as you know, range from things like ending poverty, ensuring gender equality, education, sanitation and health, a whole range of issues that will improve the well-being of individuals everywhere. Now, how is the mission helping? Again, we serve as the conduit. We identify potential partners, development partners. Maybe it's in the area of technical assistance, capacity building, projects for which we can secure assistance in different forms, grants or expertise, so that we can bring those to bear to our implementers in Guyana, the agencies in Guyana responsible for implementing on the ground these projects that would lead to the achievement of these goals. So we have officers, a senior officer who is assigned to that, and all of us, in fact, we are very much attuned to the need to ensure that we identify possible sources of assistance. And as you know, we need assistance in many different areas, and we channel these through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to the various agencies in Guyana.
Could you, Ambassador, provide an example of one case where this partnership was channeled to Guyana towards the SDG?
Well, let's take the example of, there are two examples that are fresh in my mind right now because we had meetings recently, and in fact, His Excellency the President was involved in one of them. But let me take one that goes back a few months, 2 or 3 months ago, which is the promotion of ecotourism, because the SDGs deal with overall economic progress and development, the strengthening of the economy, and tourism is an important part, potentially, of that range of activities that can contribute to the wealth and well-being of Guyana. We have been at the mission in talks with Suriname through ambassador to ambassador. And we have been promoting an idea, a concept at this stage, which is the Guyana Shield project. And this is the idea of offering potential tourists not only sites in Guyana, but the Guyana Shield as a tourism product. We have started talks between Suriname and Guyana. We had hoped to involve French Guyana, but that is not an independent country. And who knows, in the future we can maybe involve the other countries of the Guyana Shield, Venezuela, even Colombia, even a part of Brazil, way out in the northeast, Amapá. But for the time being, it's a project that concerns Guyana and Suriname. And we have met with the World Trade Organization here. We have been in touch with the Ministry of Tourism and the director of the Tourism Association of Guyana, Mr. Sinclair. And hopefully from that will emerge assistance from the World Trade Organization. We've met with the head of that organization, in fact, as well as the head of the liaison office here in New York. And they have committed to providing assistance in the form of an expert who will go out there, who will do a needs assessment and help us to come up with a national tourism development strategy, which will focus not only on the development of sites, because we have great sites, as you know, in Guyana, SITE, but we don't have access to those sites, and the sites themselves are not developed in the sense of, for example, Kaicho Falls guardrails, Kaicho Falls a lodge that you would want to spend several days in just as a destination in itself. So the development of the site, access to the site in different ways, by road, by air, by river, airlift capacity, and that's another aspect which may not be within the purview of that project, but it is a concern. And when you think of any aspect of development, you have to think about it holistically. What else is needed? So how do people get to Guyana? And often when we talk about tourism in Guyana, we are asked the question, how do you get there? What is the connectivity like, and so on? So that is another aspect. And then the marketing, the promotion of awareness. And the WTO, which has the World Trade Tourism Organization, which has a lot of experience in this field, is willing to provide the expertise that we need to develop these 3 or 4 aspects of our tourism product.
Can you share with us what the second example is?
The second example is an agency which used to be part of UNDP. As you know, UNDP is one of the main partners for development in Guyana. And the resident representative there coordinates the work of the various United Nations agencies in Guyana. Now, some 20 years ago or so, the implementing arm of UNDP was separated from UNDP, and it became an independent body to implement projects and projects that were developed and conceived by UNDP. So we had the good fortune to have some preliminary meetings here in the mission with the head of the partnership unit within that. It's called UNOPS, United Nations Office for Project Services, UNOPS. Remember that name because I think it may be a name that we will be hearing a lot about in the future. And they basically do something that not many United Nations agencies do. They actually walk you through the implementation aspect of project development. You know, you have to conceive of a project, you have to come up with your project proposal, design, and so on. But they will actually see you through even the design phase, even the conception, because sometimes in our countries we have some ideas as to what we need, but we are not able, for different reasons. Sometimes it has to do with technical capacity to articulate this need in a way that becomes the term they use is bankable, that you can submit it as a project for financing. This UNOPS does that. And so I had the first meeting here a few weeks ago with the head of the partnership unit, and 2 days ago His Excellency met with the head of the executive director of UNOPS, who is based, I believe, in Denmark or in Scandinavia. And we talked of ways in which UNOPS can assist Guyana in not identifying, we will have to identify, but in shaping and framing those needs in a way that they become projects. And what is interesting about UNOPS is that they not only provide some limited amount of grant money to get the project started, but they have experience in creating partnerships, in matching your needs with potential partners, not only from the government side, but the private sector as well. So they can actually find a third party to match the need that you articulate, and they can provide services like the supervision of the project, monitoring, and so on. So it's a very exciting prospect, and I believe that we will be hearing, as I said, a lot about UNOPS and what we can do in the very near future, because it's at a stage now where we have been asked to identify, prioritize a few projects, and these are large-scale projects, infrastructural projects, social housing projects, for example. And we have a process that has begun now, where hopefully we can see some of these realized on the ground in Guyana.
Ambassador, if I may ask, does the mission also, because you mentioned the pillar, the social security,
Peace and security.
Peace and security, does the mission work in that sector as well on behalf of Guyana? We would have known that the President has supported the call for reform of the Security Council in the UN, so that smaller states have a greater voice. Is the mission working or advocating Guyana's position at the UN in that regard?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because I was looking for a chance to tell you what we're doing in that area. First of all, as you said, and as the President himself noted, we have a real vested interest in an international system based on the rule of law. That's the only hope that small states have of being able to survive and thrive in the world, so that we don't have a situation where might is right and the powerful make the rules. So we are very interested in all of those bodies within the UN system that help to define, to shape those rules, the architecture within which we operate. So the interest of Guyana in a rules-based system is very clear. And the Security Council in the area of peace and security is the organ that enforces compliance with those rules. It's the only body that can actually impose, take action to force a member state to follow a certain course of action. And we have been active. I will probably have an opportunity to tell you about the way we work through CARICOM. We are a small mission, so we don't have the number of staff to follow every single issue that may be of interest to us. So we do some workload sharing with CARICOM. And under that arrangement, Guyana is the coordinator on behalf of CARICOM, the 14 member countries of CARICOM, of this particular issue of Security Council reform. And so I have been very much involved in that personally since I took office last year. Essentially what we're doing is having each year what we call the intergovernmental negotiations, IGN sessions that last for a few months. Starts, I believe, around January, February, would go up to June. And this past year we had 3 sessions lasting several days, and I went to Qatar as part of a retreat to kind of brainstorm ways of reforming the Security Council. Now the reform is intended to strengthen the rule of law, but we are operating, unfortunately, under a system that was designed for a different world way back in 1946. And so you have this situation where the composition of the Security Council, and in particular the composition of the 5 members who have veto power, reflects the balance of power in the world in 1946, essentially the victors of the Second World War. And things have changed a lot since then. There are many emerging countries, like Brazil, like India, which have clout and weight and whose voices deserve to be heard. And you also have a situation where some of the losers in the war have been rehabilitated, and Japan and Germany, and they have a legitimate case as well. But you also have an even more egregious example of the weakness of the current system, which is the fact that Africa is not at all represented. So you have a situation where most of the cases that are brought to the Security Council for action, peacekeeping missions to different trouble spots in Africa, they constitute a disproportionate share of the effort that is required by the Security Council to deal with these threats to peace and security, and yet they have no representation. So Guyana has been consistent in its support for an expanded council in terms of the non-permanent seats. As you know, it has a total of 15, 10 of which are non-permanent, rotating, and Guyana will be a candidate in a few years' time. I think it's 2024 to 25. The elections will be held in 2023. So we are candidates for a seat in the council, not the first time, but it's been a long time since we sat in the council. And so we have advocated an increase in the number not only of the non-permanent seats, but the seats. But it's a very difficult question, as you might imagine, because any decision that is made would have to be ratified and endorsed by the very members who have this power of veto. And I have to say that the negotiations have been going on now for 24 years. And I don't think we are any closer to a solution to a reform package that is acceptable to all the member states. I think, however, there's growing awareness and growing acceptance, even on the part of the 5 members of the Council who have the power of veto, that there's need for reform. Because if you have a small number of member states within an organization that have this tremendous power, then they need the legitimacy that only acceptance by the other, my math is poor, but 180 something, I believe, it's 193, 178 countries. The other 178 countries would need to buy in and have confidence that the system under which we're operating is legitimate and it represents their interests. So you ask what Guyana has been doing. We have made many statements on that issue. We reflect the position of CARICOM. We work together with other groups. There are many different groups that pursue different interests, and there are groups that are set up to counter the initiatives of other groups. For example, you know that India, Brazil, Japan, Germany, those are the 4 countries, as well as some undetermined countries in Africa that have been cited as countries deserving. But each of them would have some other country that would take a position opposite, because they are in fact rivals at a regional level of those 4 countries that I mentioned. So we have a high profile there, and I intend to continue, even though, as I said, the results are not very encouraging at this stage, but Guyana will continue to speak out because we have this vested interest, as I said, in a rules-based system, international system. We have unanimity within CARICOM on what our goals are in the negotiations. What we don't have is sufficient clout to realize those goals, because there are other interests within the membership of the UN that are opposed to those objectives. But our objectives are clear, and there's unanimity within CARICOM as to what we should be pursuing. I mentioned one of them, which is support for Africa. There's another one I should have mentioned, which is that there should always be a seat. We call it a roving seat for small states, small island developing countries, low-lying coastal states. We should recognize that there needs to be a voice for small, vulnerable states in the highest forums of the United Nations. So those are agreed positions, And we also agree that the council, as currently constituted, does not have the legitimacy that it needs to be effective. And so we don't have to negotiate on that. What we have to continue doing is to speak with one voice, so that whenever a block of 14 countries gets up to speak through the coordinator, myself, others would take notice. It's not a single country, but 14 countries, which is a significant block of votes within the United Nations system.
Now, Ambassador, the work that you're doing is a lot. And you're working from New York here in your office. I'm trying to get you to bridge the importance of the work here to the man and woman back home in Guyana. Could you just highlight how it is that the work that you're doing here is important to the Guyanese back home?
Well, first of all, this is an opportunity, and that's why I accepted to speak with you, an opportunity to talk about the work of the mission and what the possibilities are in terms of what we could do. There are many obstacles in the way of implementing some of the projects, the ideas, the concepts that are discussed here. But in terms of the practical benefit, I was home a few months ago, I think, and I was in a meeting, and maybe you were there as well. It was the heads of mission meeting. Conference. And in one of the folders, there was information about scholarships from the government of Malta, which I had, a few weeks before that, I had signed out and followed up with the mission and sent off. So maybe it was not in the folder. I think it was actually an advertisement in the papers asking Guyanese who met the requirements to apply for these scholarships. And it struck me, and I mentioned this in the heads of missions conference, that this is good to see the practical application of some of the paperwork that we do and the lobbying and so on. Capacity building is very important. Training opportunities, very, very important. Development, I'm convinced that many people are convinced, really begins up here. You don't have to have resources, and we have resources. You have to have imagination and the will to implement, and a system that would allow imagination to flourish. And there are many examples of that. So you've got that aspect. You've got, I don't want to dwell too much on this because we're not equipped to handle investment proposals. But take, for example, the UNOPS example that I just cited. If that is implemented, if there's follow-up, if our agencies in Guyana are on the ball and are able to take advantage, we can actually see projects on the scale of hundreds of millions of dollars, because we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about roads that would require that kind of capital. So that is another area which is now emerging because we've recently started discussions. But if you look at it in a broader sense, the man in the street in Guyana is affected and benefits in so many ways from the standards. You take, for example, some of the human rights conventions. So we have signed on to a number of them. I don't want to get into discussion of particular human rights issues because there's a lag between where the developed world is going and the pace at which we are able to follow in terms of legislation and so on. But the fact that standards are being set, and we are, at least in terms of the principle, committing to live up to those higher standards, will affect the man in the street in terms of respect for human dignity, respect for gender, gender differences, sexual orientation, things like that. It may take some time, there are obstacles, but that is where we're heading. And these new norms are being developed here at the United Nations. And you may take one other example. We talk a lot about the SDGs, but when you commit as a country to achieve the SDGs and you say you will end poverty, you will ensure education for all, that is a practical demonstration of how a concept that's developed here Well, not here, because it's all of the member governments would have been part of those negotiations to determine which objectives will be retained as part of the 70. But you can see the impact if it becomes the norm that every person should benefit from education, I think up to the secondary level. And you have this emphasis on leaving no one behind. So the vulnerable, the disadvantaged in Guyana right now, if these new norms take hold, we would have policies that would ensure that they are not left behind, because we've committed at the UN in public forums and in terms of legislation that this is going to be a goal that the country would follow. So there are many, many ways in which this new architecture that is being designed here and is getting international support will have an impact on ordinary people in Guyana.
Thank you for joining us. We were joined by Ambassador Michael Tenpau, Guyana's permanent representative to the United Nations, sharing with us the work the Guyana mission here in New York has been doing at the UN.